I never thought I would have to press charges against my own mother. But when she lunged at me in my own driveway because I refused to pay for the siblings I barely know, I realized that some bridges don't just burn, they need to be demolished for your own survival. My mother was 20 years old when she gave birth to me, still young enough to believe that life could be fixed simply by surviving one more difficult year, and still inexperienced enough not to realize how long the consequences of certain decisions can echo through a child's entire existence. My biological father never wanted children. She told me that much herself, years later, with a tone that suggested it was a simple fact rather than a wound. They had only been dating for a few months when she became pregnant, and when she told him, she also told him he was free to leave. He did. Quietly. Completely. As if either of us had ever existed. She chose not to pursue child support, explaining that the breakup had been bitter and that demanding anything from him would only prolong the pain. He refused to pay anyway, and in the end, disappearing from each other's lives was convenient for both of them. What she rarely acknowledged was that convenience for adults often becomes abandonment for children. If not for my grandparents, I don't know what would have happened to her, or to me. They stood by her without hesitation, giving her a place to live, helping her finish school, watching me while she worked, and offering encouragement that never seemed to run out. I grew up surrounded by their quiet stability, believing that family meant people who stayed, people who showed up even when it was inconvenient. For a long time, I thought that was simply how life worked. As I grew older, my mother dated a few men, none of whom stayed long enough to matter. Then, when I was about 8 years old, she met Harry, a co-worker. They dated for over 3 years before getting married, and while Harry and I were never close, we coexisted without conflict. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't cruel either. He was simply there, another adult in the house, another presence I learned to navigate around. When my mother became pregnant 4 years after they married, everything changed. Everyone was overjoyed. Friends, relatives, co-workers, everyone congratulated her, celebrated her, spoke excitedly about the future. I smiled and shared in the excitement, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet fear began to take root. Looking back now, I recognize that fear for what it was, instinct. I worried that I would be replaced, that the fragile balance we had would shift in ways I couldn't yet understand. Still, I told myself that my mother had raised me alone through so many hardships, that she wouldn't suddenly stop supporting me now. I was wrong. As her pregnancy progressed, she began to distance herself from me. Conversations grew shorter. Her patience thinned. Small things I said or did seemed to irritate her in ways they never had before. I told myself it was stress, hormones, exhaustion, temporary things that would pass. I tried to be helpful, tried to be encouraging, tried to take up less space. Eventually, to avoid upsetting her, I made myself scarce, spending more time in my room, at friends' houses, anywhere that wouldn't disturb the fragile atmosphere in our home. It wasn't enough. 6 months after she gave birth to twins, she and Harry sat me down for what they called a serious conversation. I still remember the way they positioned themselves across from me, the way their expressions were careful, rehearsed, as if they had practiced what they were about to say. They told me they couldn't keep me in the house anymore. They explained that they now had 2 children to care for, that their resources were stretched thin, that the financial burden of raising a large family on their income was simply too much. Legally, they couldn't throw me out. I was still a minor, freshly 16, but they didn't need to. Instead, they spoke about responsibility, about sacrifice, about how hard things were for them, hoping I would understand and make the right decision on my own. What struck me, even then, was how false it all sounded. We had been living comfortably. 2 adults, 1 teenager, and now 2 infants, all supported by the salaries of 2 web engineers. Money had never been an issue before. The truth was obvious, even if they never said it outright, they didn't want me there anymore. Desperate not to be discarded, I tried to negotiate my own existence. I offered to get a job, to contribute financially, to do whatever it took to stay. That was when my mother said the words that changed everything. She told me she wanted to save her money and resources for the children who deserved it more. She didn't say they needed it more. She said they deserved it. That distinction mattered. It told me everything I needed to know. In that moment, I understood that staying would mean shrinking myself until there was nothing left. They hadn't forced me out outright because they didn't have to. They knew I still had enough dignity to leave once I realized I was unwanted. And so, without being given anywhere to go, without guidance or concern for what would happen to me, I packed my things and walked out. I went straight to my grandparents' house. They were furious when they found out what my mother had done, but they didn't cut her off. The twins were innocent, they said. They didn't want to lose contact with them. I learned early that fairness often takes a back seat to family politics. At 16, I got a part-time job because I didn't want to burden my grandparents, who were already advanced in age. When my mother and Harry occasionally visited them with the twins, they barely acknowledged me. Our interactions were stiff, formal, devoid of warmth. What hurt most was how happy my mother seemed, how much calmer she was without me around. The irritability I remembered from before was gone, as if removing me from her life had solved a problem she never admitted existed. When it came time for college, my mother was nowhere to be found. She and Harry refused to help, insisting they needed to preserve their money for the twins' future. My grandparents couldn't assist with moving me into my dorm, so friends stepped in. I took out student loans, and one of my uncles agreed to co-sign, trusting me when I promised he would never have to pay a cent. I worked throughout college, balancing classes with shifts, determined not to fall behind, determined not to fail. My mother didn't attend my graduation. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't ask how I was doing. After college, I moved out as quickly as I could, unwilling to remain dependent on my grandparents any longer. The early years were difficult. I lived modestly, carefully budgeting for rent, utilities, groceries, and loan payments. There were months where I had little left over, but I kept going. Slowly, things improved. I climbed the ranks at my organization, earning my place without shortcuts or favors. Eventually, I reached a point where I could finally say I was comfortable. Proud, even. And that was when my mother came back. By the time I was 33, I had learned how to live without expecting anything from her. That lesson, painful as it was, had shaped nearly every part of my adult life. I kept my circle small. I trusted slowly. I celebrated my achievements quietly, if at all. Success, to me, was something private, something fragile that didn't need to be shared with people who had already proven they would only notice it when it became useful to them. For months before everything unraveled, I received a major promotion. I had worked at the same organization since the beginning of my career, climbing steadily, methodically, earning respect one project at a time. When the offer came, it felt surreal. I was now one of the youngest people in a senior management role at the firm. It was the kind of milestone people celebrate loudly, publicly, proudly. I told almost no one. The only person I felt compelled to inform was my uncle, the one who had co-signed my student loan years earlier, taking on a responsibility that no one else had been willing to accept. I wanted him to know that his trust hadn't been misplaced, that I had made something of myself despite everything. I didn't think beyond that. I didn't imagine consequences. I should have. At a family gathering, he ran into my mother and Harry. Proud, well-intentioned, and unaware of the damage he was about to cause, he told her about my promotion. He encouraged her to reach out, to congratulate me, to reconnect. He assumed that time had softened things, that distance had healed what silence had broken. She didn't contact me. Not a message. Not a call. Not even a shallow, obligatory congratulations. Instead, a few weeks later, she appeared at my door. Seeing her standing there with Harry beside her felt like watching a memory step out of a photograph, one I had carefully tucked away and forgotten. I hadn't spoken to her since I started college. I had blocked her everywhere, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. I told myself that if she ever reached out, it would be because she had changed. That hope, faint as it was the only reason I let them inside. They didn't come to apologize. They sat in my living room and spoke as if no time had passed at all, as if 18 years of absence could be brushed aside with casual familiarity. They mentioned my promotion, noting how surprised they were that I hadn't told them. They seemed offended, genuinely offended, that I had shut them out of my life, framing it as a choice I had made out of bitterness rather than a consequence of their actions. They said they had only prioritized their children over me. As if that explanation absolved everything. They told me I should have been mature enough, at 16, to understand their rearranged priorities. That I shouldn't have harbored resentment. That I should have supported their decisions instead of going to live with my grandparents. Listening to them speak, I realized they genuinely believed this version of events, one where they were victims of circumstance, and I was an ungrateful child who refused to adapt. Then they told me about their struggles. They had started their own company, they said. It failed. They lost money. Things had been hard for years. As they spoke, something inside me settled into a cold, quiet certainty. I knew why they were here long before they said it out loud. The twins were nearing college age. They needed money. They didn't ease into the request. They didn't frame it as help or ask for support. They told me that paying for my siblings' education would be a way for me to make it up to them, as if this were some moral debt I owed. They even implied they were doing me a favor, allowing me the opportunity to support children I barely knew, children who had replaced me so completely that my absence had never troubled them. I told them no. Immediately. Clearly. Without hesitation. The anger that rose in me surprised even myself, not loud, not explosive, but sharp and controlled, the kind that comes from finally seeing a pattern too clearly to ignore. I reminded them that I had worked through college because they refused to help, that I had taken on debt because they wanted to save for their real children. I told them they had no right to expect financial support from me now, after choosing to erase me from their lives when I was still a child. They didn't listen. Instead, they blamed me. They said I had been difficult, overly involved, irritable. They accused me of being part of the problem back then, as if a teenager's attempts to hold on to his family were some kind of moral failing. They said I was no better than them now, that by refusing to help, I was doing exactly what they had done to me. That was when something finally broke. They reminded me of all the sacrifices my mother had made raising me alone, as if fulfilling a legal and moral obligation was some extraordinary favor I now needed to repay. They told me this was my chance to prove I wasn't selfish, to show gratitude, to finally put someone else before myself. I realized then that they were incapable of remorse. There was no version of this conversation where they would acknowledge the harm they had caused, no scenario where they would see me as anything other than a resource they had temporarily misplaced. I asked them to leave. When they resisted, when they continued to argue and deflect and accuse, I threatened to call the police. Only then did they go. Afterward, the silence felt different. Heavier. Final. I contacted my uncle and told him what had happened. He was horrified. He apologized repeatedly, admitting that he never should have shared my life with her without my consent. He didn't know about their financial situation. He didn't expect this. I believed him. He had been there for me when no one else was, and while his mistake had consequences, it wasn't born of malice. I made it clear that my boundaries mattered, and he respected that. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. After that day, I told myself it was over. I believed that setting a boundary, clear, firm, unambiguous, would finally be enough. I had underestimated how dangerous desperation becomes when it's fueled by entitlement rather than need. A few days later, emails started arriving. Every other day, sometimes more often, my mother wrote to remind me of everything she had done for me while raising me alone. She listed sacrifices as if they were transactions, as if love had always been conditional and now the bill was due. She framed herself as the victim of my success, as though my stability was an insult to her suffering. Reading her words felt like being slowly erased all over again, reduced to an obligation that had matured into profit. For a while I ignored her. But the messages kept coming, and eventually, I responded, not out of hope, but out of a need for clarity. I explained everything I had carried with me for years: how being pushed out at 16 had shaped my life, how being told I was less deserving had never stopped echoing, how her absence had forced me to grow up faster than I should have had to. I didn't accuse. I didn't exaggerate. I simply told the truth. She called me ungrateful. That was all the confirmation I needed. I blocked her email. She created another account and continued. I blocked that one too. I realized then that she wasn't interested in resolution, only control. The moment I stopped responding, I felt something loosen inside me. The hope I had carried, quietly and foolishly, finally let go. She wasn't capable of regret, guilt, or shame, and she never would be. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. One morning, my workplace called to tell me my mother was there, asking to see me and refusing to leave. I wasn't even in the office that day. I had taken time off because I wasn't feeling well, but just knowing she had shown up there made my chest tighten with panic. When the receptionist put her on the phone, I told her plainly that I wasn't there and that if she ever came to my place of employment again, I would take legal action. I said it calmly, deliberately, making sure my voice carried weight. It worked. She left. For a moment, I believed that would be enough, that embarrassment and fear would finally succeed where reason had failed. I started looking into legal options, speaking with an attorney about boundaries and protection, unsure whether what I had experienced was enough to justify a restraining order. Then, a few days later, I came home from work and found her waiting outside my door. I told her to leave. I warned her I would call the police. I reached for my phone, and before I could dial, she lunged at me. She knocked me to the ground, screaming, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in her life. The shock froze me for a moment, disbelief slowing my reactions, until instinct took over. I was younger, stronger, and physically capable of defending myself. I restrained her as neighbors rushed out, drawn by the noise, holding her back until the police arrived. I pressed charges. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, and the easiest. In the days that followed, everything unraveled. I was granted a restraining order. Harry took the twins and left, unable to defend her behavior any longer. My grandparents, exhausted and heartbroken, finally cut contact with her as well. One by one, the relationships she had relied on collapsed under the weight of her actions. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt relief. For the first time, I understood that closure doesn't come from reconciliation, it comes from acceptance. From recognizing that some people are incapable of seeing beyond themselves, and that no amount of success, sacrifice, or explanation will ever change that. I'm doing well now. Better than I ever imagined I would when I was 16 and standing on my grandparents' doorstep with a bag of clothes and nowhere else to go. I'm thinking about moving, about building a life that feels fully mine, unshadowed by guilt or obligation. I hope my mother gets the help she needs. I truly do. But I no longer believe it's my responsibility to save her. Some families don't fall apart in loud explosions. Some dissolve quietly, one choice at a time, until the distance becomes permanent. And sometimes, walking away isn't abandonment, it's survival.